The Alamo by John Myers Myers. Read by Robert Morris. Forward. In the absence of footnotes, it seems fitting to make a statement about the source material of the ensuing narrative. Barring versions which may exist in manuscript, this is the first chronicle of the Alamo which seeks to present the story of that historic structure in full. Finding and assembling the necessary parts has been a fascinating, but at the same time, complicated business. Before they could be recognized with sureness, many of the scattered pieces were walked past time and again. Dozens upon dozens of those available were suspect upon discovery because mutually contradictory. The spurious could only be discarded with confidence after months of reviewing and collating. It was at first surprising that information about so famous a fort should be hard to come by. In the light of actualities, no surprise should have been felt. The truth is that the story of the Alamo is at once familiar to everybody and not known at all. The name has always been one to conjure with, but the name has belonged to a formless, if glorious, shade rather than to a solid body. Outside of Texas, even contemporaries of the siege had little accurate information. The few people who did know the story, or parts of it at first hand, were not professional writers, and no enterprising historian sought them out. In the fashion of the day, some of them wrote private journals, most of which have achieved circulation only in this century. The informative letters of certain ones have been preserved, while the pertinent statements of others have been passed down, not always in the form of direct quotations. Scholars like Yoakum and Bancroft have added to the sum of knowledge, but in the main it can be said that the facts have been saved in spite of histories rather than through their agency. As the members of the Alamo garrison were killed to a man, a natural question is, who then was qualified to write or speak authoritatively? The list begins with the dead warriors themselves, notably Travis, who sent out a number of letters containing details as to the progress of the siege. Then there were non-combatant and semi-non-combatant inmates of the fort who survived the event. The number of these has not been computed to everyone's satisfaction, but there were a dozen more or less. Among those who left words for the record was the only American woman present, a Mrs. Almiram Dickinson, whose husband was an officer of the garrison. A Mrs. Horace Alsbury, who in spite of her name was a Mexican, also had something to say. She claimed to have been in the fort throughout the siege, whereas Mrs. Dickinson asserted that she was allowed to leave and take refuge with her fellow countrymen 2 or 3 days before the end. Mrs. Dickinson also accused her of betraying the spent condition of the garrison to Santa Anna, although that could have been no more than an assumption on her part. Joe, Travis's Negro body servant, apparently spared as an involuntary combatant, for he mentioned having a pistol, was interviewed by Houston and others a few days after the siege. There has been a tendency to put his statements aside, which seems unwarranted. He is described as intelligent, and he was there to see. Of the children present, one, called Jose Enriquez, was 8 at the time, and was therefore able to recall certain things with tolerable clarity later on. His contribution was not large, but he did definitely remember that there was no such person within the walls of the Alamo as Madame Candelaria. For that reason, because of the absence of a corroborative testimony, and because of the existence of quite a body of confuting evidence, the presence of the Candelaria woman is not acceptable. In addition, there were actual members of the garrison who left before the final assault, and thus were in a position to tell a portion of the story. Apparently between 10 and 15 couriers got through the Mexican lines at one stage or another of the combat. Regrettably, none of these left any written record of his own, but the statements of 2 were cited by people who later wrote them down. The ones referred to are Captain Juan Seguin, a Mexican officer of the Alamo garrison, and John W. Smith, who was in and out of the fort twice. The only remaining garrison member who outlived the siege was Louis Rose, the French mercenary who deserted. He has generally been catalogued as a legend because his story didn't become common property until late in the 19th century. Recently, however, a scholar has unearthed a bundle of Texas court records for the years just following the siege. In not just one, but in a number of cases relative to the disposal of property of men who had died in the Alamo, Rose's testimony was accepted as that of a man who had seen them in the fort not long before they were killed. With reservations, and allowing for the confessed coloration supplied by the man who finally wrote it down, his statement is admissible. Civilian observation from without is represented by Francisco Ruiz, alcalde of San Antonio at the time, and a man more or less friendly to both parties. As an official of a Mexican town, his services were requisitioned by Santa Anna. In particular, he was ordered, as he recorded, to have a group of citizens standing by to assist the wounded at the time of the final assault, and he was subsequently given the duty of segregating the bodies of the Alamo defenders from those of Mexican soldiers. Mexican officers, including Santa Anna, wrote about the Alamo, but it should be noted that they did it under stress, after the Texas campaign was a failure. In general, they weren't too concerned with facts. Their intent was primarily to salvage their damaged military reputations, and secondarily, to cut each other's throats politically. At various points, their contradictory statements can profitably be checked against those of Sergeant Becerra, an intelligent Mexican enlisted man, whose somewhat high-flown report also got on the record. If the Mexican generals later wrote for their own benefit, their official orders are something else again, and a valuable document in the form of a diary was taken from Colonel Juan N. Almonte, Santa Anna's chief aide. His brief daily notations make it possible to follow the siege from the attacker's viewpoint. Then, above and beyond the letters, quotations, memoirs, orders, manifestos, and depositions, there was, as there nearly always is in such cases, a floating mass of details, the common knowledge of those intimate with the story at the time, but attributable to no one in particular. Sometimes they turn up in a group, while at other times they are found loose, off by themselves. Many so dovetail with provable facts that they must be accepted. Others have had to be rejected because they match with nothing. Often indistinguishable from this class of data are the rumors which start almost simultaneously with the event, appearing as mysteriously as fruit flies when a bottle of wine is opened. In his maturity, for instance, one Texas memorialist confessed that as a youngster he invented a story of the last minutes of the Alamo to impress some greenhorns from the States. He hadn't expected to be taken seriously by anyone else, and was confounded to discover that his version was being generally accepted as fact. The story he invented was that there were 5 last survivors of the garrison, of whom David Crockett was one, who surrendered on honorable terms only to be murdered. That tale, fabricated within 10 days of the fall of the Alamo, is now cited in encyclopedias and dictionaries. Much confusion would have been avoided had there been an effort to investigate on the part of competent newspapermen, but there was none. The early reports, including those prepared by historians, were a jumble of facts, rumors, and guesswork. Yoakum found out much of the story, but he came along a couple of decades later, when many of the parts had already been buried in letters and diaries relegated to the attic. And in any case, a man writing the history of a state could afford to devote so much space and no more to a single incident, however important. The first to publish a separate account of the siege of the Alamo based on personal investigation didn't do so until 1860. This was Captain Reuben Marmaduke Potter, who revamped his pamphlet some years later. The captain had just about the neatest reportorial style since Caesar wrote about Gaul, but he confessedly often had to substitute military probability